Dr. Ashworth returned to his examination, but found his concentration broken. The light, never strong, seemed to be failing, though his watch showed barely past noon. The shadows between the standing stones had deepened, and he caught himself glancing into them repeatedly. Though he could not have said what he expected to see, he was preparing to take a rubbing of the inscription when he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was a physical thing, a prickling at the back of his neck, a tension in his shoulders. He turned sharply, scanning the clearing. Nothing. The trees stood motionless. The broken walls maintained their blank vigil, and yet, in the deepest shadow beneath the fragment of south wall, where the two lancet windows framed a rectangle of darkness, something seemed to shift. Not a movement, precisely. More a change in the quality of the shadow itself, a suggestion of form where no form should be. Dr. Ashworth stared, willing his eyes to make sense of what they might be seeing. For a moment, the briefest moment, he thought he discerned a figure standing there, tall and thin, draped in something that might have been a robe or simply a trick of light and shade. Then it was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Only the empty window and the darkness beyond. Dr. Ashworth discovered that his hands were shaking slightly. He forced himself to be rational. The light was poor. His imagination stirred by the atmosphere of the place and perhaps by his disturbed sleep of the previous night. There was nothing here but old stones and shadows. Nevertheless, he found himself packing his things with more haste than was his custom. As he worked, he became aware of another oddity. The fragment of vellum he had discovered the previous evening. He had brought it with him, meaning to examine it in light of whatever he might find at the priory. He was certain he had placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, yet when he reached for it now, it was not there. He searched through all his pockets. His satchel, even shook out his notebook, in case it had somehow become caught between the pages. Nothing. The document had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The walk back through the copse seemed longer than the journey out. Twice Dr. Ashworth was convinced he had lost the path, though his compass assured him he was heading in the correct direction. The trees seemed closer together, their branches reaching overhead like grasping fingers, and always, just at the edge of hearing, that faint sound that might have been a whisper or wind, or perhaps only the blood rushing in his own ears. He emerged into Hangman's Field with a relief he would not have cared to admit. The gray daylight, though cheerless, seemed bright after the gloom of the copse. He set off across the field at a brisk pace, eager to reach the village and the comfortable solidity of the inn. He had nearly reached the far side when he noticed it one of those curious circular depressions directly in his path. He had somehow not observed it on his outward journey. As he approached, meaning to skirt around it, he stopped abruptly. In the center of the depression, half covered by grass and soil, lay a stone. It was worked stone, clearly shaped by human hands, roughly rectangular, perhaps 2 feet long, and on its surface, barely visible beneath the accumulated grime of years, were markings. Dr. Ashworth knelt beside it, his scholar's instincts overcoming his growing unease. He brushed away some of the dirt with his handkerchief. The markings became clear, angular, deliberate characters, carved deep into the stone. They were the same characters that had appeared in the margin of the mysterious vellum. He stared at them for a long moment, his mind working rapidly. This stone, in this field, with these markings, it suggested something far older than the medieval priory, something that the priory itself might have been built to sanctify or contain. The depressions across the field, could they be graves? But graves of what age, and for whom? A shadow fell across the stone, and Dr. Ashworth looked up sharply. The sun had broken through the clouds. He had not noticed it happening, and the shadow was merely his own. Yet for that instant before recognition, his heart had hammered with irrational fear. He rose quickly, brushing the dirt from his hands, and continued toward the village without looking back. But the image of those strange characters remained with him, and with it a growing conviction that his innocent scholarly expedition had somehow become entangled with something far less innocent, something that had been waiting in these fields and ruins for a very long time. Indeed, Dr. Ashworth spent the remainder of the afternoon in his room at the inn, attempting to sketch from memory both the characters he had seen on the stone in Hangman's Field and those from the vanished vellum. His reproductions were necessarily imperfect, but he captured enough to be certain they were essentially identical. The script was runic in character, but unlike any standard runic alphabet, it possessed an archaic quality that suggested great age, and there was something about the angles and proportions that seemed deliberately unsettling, as though the shapes themselves were meant to disturb the eye. He had brought with him several reference works, including a volume on early British inscriptions, but nothing in his small library offered any insight. The closest match was to certain Scandinavian rune stones, but even these were significantly different. Whatever language or system of writing this represented, it was not one with which he was familiar. As evening approached, Dr. Ashworth descended to the taproom, hoping that conversation with the locals might yield some information about the stone he had discovered. The room was moderately populated. Several farm laborers, an elderly man who might have been a retired gamekeeper, and a woman who appeared to be the landlord's wife, occupied with mending by the fire. Dr. Ashworth ordered his dinner, and when Godbold brought it, ventured to ask about the depressions in Hangman's Field. The landlord's face closed immediately. "Old things," he said shortly, "best left alone, but surely there must be some local tradition about them. They appear to be quite ancient. There's them as say things," Godbold admitted reluctantly, "but it's all old wives' tales like as not. I would be most interested to hear them. Old wives' tales or not." The landlord glanced toward the other occupants of the room. The elderly man had stopped his conversation and was watching them with a wary expression. The woman by the fire kept her eyes on her mending, but her hands had ceased moving. "They say it's the 7, Godbold said at last, his voice low. "The 7 as was put down in the old time, before even the Danes came. Put down and marked, so they shouldn't walk. And the nature of these 7, were they criminals of some sort?" "Not criminals, sir. Not rightly." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "They was priests, after a fashion, of the old ways, if you take my meaning. The ways as was here before the church came. They practiced things rights that wasn't right. Least, that's what was said. And when the new religion came, they wouldn't give it up. So they was dealt with, executed, aye, and buried where they fell, with the marks set over them to keep them down." Godbold straightened, as if regretting having said so much. "But it's all old stories, like I said. Nothing to it." Dr. Ashworth thanked him and let the matter drop, but his mind was racing. 7 depressions in the field, the 7 who were put down. The marked stones noli me tangere. The priory built nearby, perhaps deliberately, to sanctify ground that had once been used for less Christian purposes. It was beginning to form a picture, though not one that entirely satisfied his rational mind. After dinner, he returned to his room and lit the lamp, intending to spend the evening working on his notes, but he found concentration difficult. The room, which had seemed comfortable enough the previous night, now felt oppressive. The lamp cast strange shadows in the corners, and the old glass in the window reflected his own image back at him in a distorted, unsettling manner. He had been writing for perhaps an hour when he heard the sound. It came from above, from the attic, if the inn possessed such a space. A slow, dragging sound, as of something heavy being pulled across the floor. It moved from one end of the ceiling to the other, then stopped. Dr. Ashworth set down his pen and listened. The inn was old. Old buildings made odd noises as they settled. Yet this had not sounded like the creak of timbers. It had sounded deliberate, purposeful. The sound came again, returning across the ceiling in the opposite direction. Slow, dragging, as if whatever made it was in no hurry, or perhaps moved with difficulty. He rose and went to the door, stepping out into the corridor. It was dimly lit by a single candle on a table at the far end. "Godbold," he called. "Is someone working upstairs?" No response. The sound had stopped. The village of Thornwick lay some 7 miles inland from the Suffolk coast, a place remarkable chiefly for its obscurity. It possessed a Norman church of modest proportions, a handful of weathered cottages along a single winding street, and an inn called the Shepherd's Rest that had stood since the reign of Queen Anne. It was to this inn that Dr. Edmund Ashworth came in the late autumn of 1903, drawn by a reference in a footnote of Dugdale's Monasticon Anglicum to certain ecclesiastical ruins nearby. Dr. Ashworth was a fellow of Magdalene College, Cambridge, and a man of some 45 years whose reputation rested upon his studies of pre-conquest ecclesiastical sites. He was unmarried, methodical in his habits, and possessed of that peculiar combination of intellectual curiosity and physical stamina necessary for one who spent his summers tramping through nettle-choked graveyards and his winters poring over medieval Latin in draughty college rooms. His appearance was unremarkable medium height, graying hair, spectacles that perpetually threatened to slide down his nose, and he carried with him always a leather satchel containing notebooks, measuring tapes, and the various implements of his scholarly trade. The landlord of the Shepherd's Rest, a taciturn man named Godbold, showed Dr. Ashworth to a room overlooking the village green. It was a comfortable enough chamber, with whitewashed walls, dark beams across the ceiling, and a window of ancient glass that rendered the view beyond pleasantly distorted. After settling his belongings, Dr. Ashworth descended to the taproom to inquire about the ruins that had brought him to Thornwick. "You'll mean the old priory, sir," said Godbold, drawing a pint of ale with deliberate slowness. "St. Guthlax, it was called, though there's precious little left of it now. A mile or so north, across Hangman's Field and through the copse beyond." "Hangman's Field?" Dr. Ashworth raised an eyebrow. A suggestive name. The landlord set down the glass with more force than seemed necessary. "Old name, that. Don't know as there's any story to it." His manner suggested he had no intention of elaborating, and Dr. Ashworth, experienced in the ways of country folk reluctant to speak of local matters, did not press the point. He spent the remainder of the day examining a small collection of documents in the parish church, mostly Victorian, transcriptions of medieval deeds, and returned to the inn as dusk was falling. The evening meal was plain but adequate, and afterward he retired to his room to review his notes. It was then, as he unpacked his satchel more thoroughly, that he discovered something peculiar. Among his papers was a single sheet that he did not recognize. It was old, genuinely old, not a copy, the vellum stiff and slightly discolored, the ink a rich brown that suggested iron gall of considerable age. The writing was in Latin, in a hand he dated tentatively to the 14th century. But what arrested his attention was not the age of the document, but its content. The text appeared to be a fragment of a monastic charter concerning lands granted to the priory of St. Guthlax, but in the margin, in a different hand and darker ink, someone had written a series of words that Dr. Ashworth struggled to decipher. They were not in Latin, nor in any form of medieval English he recognized. The characters themselves were strange, angular, deliberate, reminiscent of runes, but not quite matching any runic alphabet he knew. Beneath this text, in the same hand, were 3 words in clear Latin: "Noli me tangere." "Touch me not." Dr. Ashworth sat back in his chair, perplexed. He had no recollection of acquiring this document. He had packed his satchel himself that morning in Cambridge, and was certain it had not been among his papers then. Perhaps it had become caught up with his belongings at the college library? Yet that seemed improbable. The library's medieval manuscripts were carefully catalogued and never left the reading room. He held the vellum up to the lamplight, examining it more closely. The warning in the margin seemed to have been written with some urgency. The pen strokes were heavy, pressed deep into the surface. And was it his imagination, or did the strange runic characters seem to shimmer slightly in the flickering light? Dr. Ashworth set the document aside with a faint sense of unease he could not entirely explain. Outside, the October wind had risen, rattling the window in its frame. Somewhere in the distance, he heard what might have been a dog howling, or perhaps only the wind itself finding voice in some narrow passage between buildings. He prepared for bed with his usual efficiency, but found sleep more elusive than was his custom. The mysterious document troubled him, and more than once he rose to examine it again, as if further scrutiny might reveal its origins. Each time, those angular characters in the margin seemed to catch his eye, and each time he felt an inexplicable reluctance to touch the vellum itself, as though the warning written there had been meant specifically for him when he finally slept. Sometime past midnight, his dreams were confused and unsettling images of stone corridors and shadowed doorways, and the persistent sense that he was searching for something he had lost, though he could not say what it might be. The morning dawned gray and cold. with a mist hanging low over the fields. Dr. Ashworth woke later than usual, feeling unrefreshed, and descended to find breakfast laid out in the otherwise empty dining room. Godbold brought tea and toast without comment, though Dr. Ashworth thought he detected a certain watchfulness in the landlord's manner. After breakfast, armed with his map and provisions, Dr. Ashworth set out for the ruins of St. Guthlac's Priory. The path led him through the village and then northward along a track between high hedgerows. The air was still and damp, the silence broken only by the occasional call of a crow from the bare trees overhead. Hangman's Field, when he reached it, proved to be a broad expanse of rough pasture, rising slightly to the north. No sheep or cattle grazed there, and the grass grew rank and coarse. At the far end, perhaps half a mile distant, he could see the dark line of the copse Godbold had mentioned. The field had an abandoned quality that seemed at odds with the otherwise well-tended countryside surrounding Thornwick. As Dr. Ashworth crossed the field, he became aware of an oddity in the landscape. At irregular intervals, the ground was disturbed by small depressions, roughly circular, perhaps 6 feet in diameter. They were old, filled with grass and partially eroded but unmistakably artificial. There were 7 or 8 of them that he could count, scattered across the field with no apparent pattern. He paused at one, examining it with professional interest. The depth was perhaps 2 feet, possibly more before centuries of weather had partially filled it in. It might have been a clay pit or the foundation of some medieval structure, though the location and form seemed wrong for either purpose. As he stood there, considering, he was struck by the absolute stillness of the place. No birds sang, no breeze stirred the grass. Even the distant sounds of the village had faded to silence. It was with some relief that he reached the copse and passed beneath its canopy. The trees were old oak and ash primarily, with thick trunks and gnarled roots that had broken through the thin soil. The path, little more than a deer track, wound between them in a manner that seemed almost deliberately maze-like. More than once Dr. Ashworth paused to consult his compass, for the gray light filtering through the bare branches gave little indication of direction. The ruins, when he finally emerged into the clearing beyond, were less extensive than he had hoped. The priory had been small, perhaps a community of no more than a dozen monks, and the dissolution had done its work thoroughly. Only portions of the church remained, a fragment of the south wall, with 2 lancet windows still intact, part of the chancel arch, and the lower courses of what had been the tower. The conventual buildings had vanished entirely, their stones doubtless carried away over the centuries for more practical constructions. Yet there was something arresting about the place nonetheless. The stones themselves, dark limestone, almost black where moisture had stained them, seemed to absorb rather than reflect what little light penetrated the surrounding trees. The lancet windows, empty of glass, stared like hollow eyes, and there was that same quality of profound silence that Dr. Ashworth had noticed in Hangman's Field, as though the ruin existed in a pocket somehow separate from the ordinary world. He set to work with his usual thoroughness, measuring, sketching, taking notes. The architectural details were interesting, more ambitious than one might expect for such a remote and modest foundation. The carving around the chancel arch, though weathered, showed considerable skill. He was attempting to decipher a fragmentary inscription on a fallen stone, when he heard the first sound. It was faint, so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. A whisper, perhaps, or the rustle of dry leaves. But the ground was damp, and there were no leaves to rustle. He straightened, listening. Nothing, only that oppressive silence, pressing close like a held breath. Dr. Ashworth climbed the stairs to the next landing. There were 2 guest rooms here, both apparently unoccupied. A narrow door at the end of the corridor presumably led to the attic, but when he tried it, he found it locked. He stood there in the shadows, listening, but heard only the ticking of a clock somewhere below. He returned to his room, vaguely annoyed with himself. He was not a fanciful man, yet he was allowing the atmosphere of this place, the strange document, the ruins, Godbold's tale of the 7, to affect his usually sound nerves. There was undoubtedly some prosaic explanation for the sounds, perhaps rats in the roof space, or pigeons, yet when the sound came a 3rd time, perhaps half an hour later, he could not convince himself it was made by any animal. It was too measured, too deliberate, and this time it was accompanied by something else, a faint scratching, as of fingernails against wood, and beneath that, so low he almost missed it, a sound that might have been breathing. Dr. Ashworth sat very still, his pen frozen above the page. The lamp flickered, though there was no draft. The scratching continued for perhaps a minute, then ceased. The breathing, if it had been breathing, faded to silence, and then, quite distinctly, he heard 3 soft knocks on the ceiling directly above his head. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably intentional. Dr. Ashworth found that he was standing, though he had no memory of rising from his chair. His heart was beating rapidly. He stared up at the ceiling, at the dark beams, at the whitewashed plaster between them. Nothing stirred, yet he could not shake the conviction that something was up there, something that knew he was below, something that was announcing its presence. He crossed to the door and locked it, an absurd gesture, perhaps, given that whatever was above was not likely to be deterred by a locked door. Then he extinguished the lamp and stood in the darkness, listening. Nothing more came. The inn settled into night silence. Eventually, Dr. Ashworth undressed and got into bed, though he did not expect to sleep. The room was profoundly dark, the thick curtains admitted no moonlight, and he lay staring upward into blackness, every sense alert. He must have dozed eventually, for he woke with a start to find the room filled with gray pre-dawn light. He was cold, very cold, and realized that the window stood open, but he had closed it before retiring. He was certain of that. The curtains stirred in the morning breeze, and there on the floor beneath the window, scattered by the wind, were several sheets of his notes. And across the topmost sheet, drawn in what looked like charcoal or soot, was a single character. It was one of the runes from the marked stone. Dr. Ashworth picked up the paper with trembling hands. The character was crude but unmistakable, drawn with what seemed like angry, violent strokes. The soot or charcoal, he could not tell which, had torn through the paper in places. He looked around the room wildly. Nothing else seemed disturbed. The door was still locked from the inside. There was no source of soot or charcoal that he could see. Yet the mark was there, undeniable, impossible to explain by any rational means. He dressed rapidly, his fingers clumsy with cold and agitation. As soon as he heard movement below, he would speak to Godbold. This could not continue. There had to be some explanation, some account of what was happening in this cursed inn. But even as he thought it, a part of his mind, the scholarly, analytical part, whispered that he already knew the explanation. He had disturbed something in Hangman's Field, something that had been marked and buried and sealed away. The warning on the vellum had been clear, noli me tangere, touch me not, and he had touched. He had knelt beside the marked stone and brushed away the earth. He had read the runes, had traced them with his eyes, had carried their image away with him. And now something had followed him home. Dr. Ashworth's conversation with Godbold that morning was unsatisfactory in the extreme. The landlord denied any knowledge of sounds in the night, insisted that the attic contained only old furniture and boxes, and showed visible alarm when Dr. Ashworth produced the paper marked with the strange rune. He would say nothing further about the 7 or about Hangman's Field, and Dr. Ashworth had the distinct impression that the man would have been relieved to see him quit the premises entirely. Frustrated, Dr. Ashworth resolved to pursue his investigations elsewhere. After breakfast, he walked to the parish church, where he had been told the rector kept a small collection of local historical materials. The rector, a Reverend Blackwell, proved to be a scholarly man of perhaps 60 years, with the mild manner and ink-stained fingers of one who spent considerable time with books. Dr. Ashworth, he said, shaking hands in the dim vestry, Godbold mentioned you were here studying the old priory, a sadly neglected site, I fear. The Victorians did some excavation 40 years ago now, but found little of interest. The records suggest it was suppressed in 1538, and the community was already much reduced by then. I am interested in the priory. Certainly, Dr. Ashworth said, but also in the site itself, the field one must cross to reach it. Hangman's Field, as it is called. Reverend Blackwell's expression became more guarded. Ah, yes, an unfortunate name, though the origin is obscure. There are various local traditions, but nothing that can be verified historically. I understood there were 7 marked graves in the field. Predating the priory by some centuries, the rector moved to a cabinet and withdrew a folder of papers. "You've been speaking with the villagers, I see. Well, there is some historical basis to the tale, though much embellished by repetition. Would you care to see what documentation exists?" Dr. Ashworth followed him to a reading table near the window. Reverend Blackwell laid out several items: a Victorian antiquarian's sketch of the field, showing the depressions, a transcription of a medieval Latin text, and a photograph, faded and brown, of what appeared to be one of the marked stones before it had become buried. "The sketch is by Edwin Whitmore," the rector explained, "who excavated at the priory in 1863. He noted the depressions and opened only one. I should mention to investigate. He found skeletal remains and this stone, which bore markings he could not decipher. The remains suggested a burial of considerable age, possibly pre-Saxon. Whitmore had the stone photographed, then reburied it and filled in the excavation. He makes a rather curious note here." The rector pointed to a line of crabbed handwriting at the bottom of the sketch, that the opening of the grave was accompanied by disturbances of an unspecified nature, and that he deemed it advisable to reseal it as soon as possible. What manner of disturbances? He doesn't elaborate, unfortunately. Whitmore was a meticulous scholar in most respects, which makes his vagueness here all the more striking. Dr. Ashworth examined the photograph closely. The stone was clearer here than in his brief glimpse yesterday. The runes covered most of its surface in neat, deliberate rows, and at the bottom, apparently added later in a different style, was a Christian cross and a line of Latin. "Can you make out the Latin?" he asked. Reverend Blackwell produced a magnifying glass. "Partially. It appears to be a formula of binding or banishment, something about 'let the unclean spirit not rise' and 'sealed in the name of.' The rest is illegible, and the medieval text." The rector handed him a yellowed sheet covered in a Victorian transcription. "This is from the priory's foundation charter, dated 1147. I'll translate. In this place, where once dwelt those who served the powers of darkness, and where their bones lie bound beneath marked stones, we establish this house in the name of St. Guthlac, that the evil may be forever chained, and the land made holy." It goes on in that vein. St. Guthlac, you may know, was a Saxon saint particularly associated with the expulsion of demons from wild places. Dr. Ashworth read the text several times. "So the priory was built specifically to sanctify the site of these burials." It would appear so. Whether the monks believed they were dealing with actual evil spirits, or merely wished to Christianize a pagan burial ground, we cannot say. The line between the metaphorical and literal was rather less distinct in the 12th century than it is today, and yet Whitmore's note suggests he encountered something that troubled him greatly. Victorian sensibilities were delicate, Reverend Blackwell said. Though his tone lacked conviction, he gathered the papers together somewhat hastily. "In any case, the graves have remained undisturbed since then. The field is considered unlucky superstitious nonsense, of course, and so it has been left fallow. I understand you visited the site yesterday." "I did, and I found one of the stones, partially exposed. The markings matched those in Whitmore's photograph." The rector's hands stilled. "Exposed. But that cannot be correct. The excavation was carefully filled in. Nevertheless, the stone was visible. Perhaps erosion has gradually revealed it." "After more than 40 years? That seems improbable." Reverend Blackwell removed his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief, a gesture that struck Dr. Ashworth as nervousness masquerading as habitual action. "Dr. Ashworth, I feel I should speak plainly. There are traditions about those graves that are frankly disturbing. I place no credence in them myself. I am a man of God and of science, but the villagers do, and I would not wish you to inadvertently cause alarm." "What traditions?" The rector replaced his spectacles. "That the 7 for that is how they are invariably termed were practitioners of a form of sorcery that allowed them to persist after death. That the marked stones are not merely grave markers but seals, keeping something contained, and that to disturb them is to risk." He trailed off, seeming embarrassed by his own words. "To risk what?" "Awakening them, allowing them to walk again. As I said, disturbing notions, but purely superstitious. Nevertheless, I would advise against further investigation of those particular remains. The priory itself is a much safer subject for scholarly inquiry." Dr. Ashworth thanked the rector and took his leave, but he did not return to the inn. Instead, he walked through the village, thinking. His rational mind rebelled against the implications of what he had learned. Yet the facts were becoming difficult to ignore. Something had been buried in that field, something considered sufficiently dangerous that it had been sealed with marked stones, and later sanctified by the construction of a priory. And now that he had disturbed one of those seals inadvertently, but no less completely for that events had been set in motion, the marked paper in his room, the sounds in the night, the sensation of being watched, were these mere psychological effects of suggestion and atmosphere, or was something genuinely responding to his interference? He found himself standing at the edge of the village, looking north across the fields. He could just make out Hangman's Field in the distance, gray under the overcast sky. As he watched, a flight of crows rose suddenly from the far end, their cries carrying faintly on the wind. They circled once, twice, then flew off to the east. The field lay empty and still. Dr. Ashworth made a decision. He would return to Cambridge. This was no longer a simple matter of ecclesiastical archaeology. Something here was beyond his competence, perhaps beyond anyone's competence. He would gather his notes, inform Godbold of his departure, and leave on tomorrow's train. Yet even as he formed this resolution, he knew it was too late. Whatever had begun when he uncovered that stone would not be so easily escaped. The thing, for he had begun to think of it as a thing, a presence. An entity had marked him in return. The rune on his paper had been a sign, a claim of ownership. He turned back toward the inn with a heavy sense of inevitability. The afternoon was drawing on, and the shadows were lengthening. Somewhere ahead, in the gathering dusk, his room waited, and above it, in the darkness of the attic, something else was waiting too. That evening, Dr. Ashworth elected to dine in the taproom rather than face the solitude of his chamber. The room was more crowded than on previous nights, and he recognized the elderly man from before, now deep in conversation with several companions. They fell silent as Dr. Ashworth entered, and he felt their eyes following him as he took a table in the corner. He had nearly finished his meal when the elderly man approached. He was a weathered individual with the permanent stoop of one who had spent his life working the land, and his eyes held a shrewdness that belied his rustic appearance. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said, his voice low, "but I'm given to understand you've been asking about the field, about the 7. "I have," Dr. Ashworth acknowledged. "I am researching the history of the area. Well." The man glanced over his shoulder, then pulled out a chair and sat uninvited. "My name's Farrow, Tom Farrow. I'm 83 years old, and I've lived in Thornwick all my life, as did my father and his father before him, and I know things about that field that others have forgot, or pretend to forget. I would be grateful for any information you could provide, Mr. Farrow." The old man leaned closer. "When I was a boy, there was an old woman in the village. Ancient she was, must have been near 100. She'd been brought up hearing tales from her grandmother, who'd heard them from hers, going back Lord knows how far. She told me once I was maybe 10 years old that the 7 weren't always dead. Not properly dead, if you take my meaning. I'm not certain I do. They was alive in some fashion, even after they was killed and buried. The stones was put on them to keep them down, and more than that to keep them separate, each in his own grave, so they couldn't join their power. Because together, she said, they could do terrible things, but apart, sealed under the marked stones, they was helpless, could only lie there in the dark and rage. And she believed this literally?" Farrow shrugged. "She believed it, and she said that's why the priory was built, not just to make the place holy, but because there had to be prayers said constant, day and night, to keep them bound. When the priory was dissolved and the monks driven out, that's when the trouble started." "What trouble?" "Disappearances, mostly. Folk would go across that field and not come back, or they'd come back changed, scared out of their wits, or else cold and strange, like something had got inside them. 3 or 4 times it happened over the years, and each time, the rector, whoever it was in those days, would go out to the field and say prayers and sometimes put a new stone on the old one. or strengthen the seal somehow. Dr. Ashworth felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. When did this last occur? Not in my lifetime, nor my father's, but my grandfather told of a time when he was young, would have been about 1830. I reckon when a farm laborer went mad after working in that field. Claimed he heard voices coming up from under the ground, calling him. They had to lock him away, and the rector went out and performed some rite or other. After that, it was quiet again. Until now, Dr. Ashworth said quietly. Pharaoh nodded slowly. Until now. You've disturbed something, sir, whether you meant to or not. And if what the old tales say is true, it won't rest easy now it's been woken. Which of the 7 did I disturb, do you know? There's no way of telling, not unless you know the marks. Each had their own sign, their own rune, carved on the stone that sealed them. If you could describe what you saw. Dr. Ashworth withdrew his notebook and showed the old man his sketch of the characters he had observed. Pharaoh studied it for a long moment, his expression growing grave. I don't know the meaning of the marks, sir. No living man does, I reckon. But I've seen drawings before. My grandfather had a paper with them on, which he got from his father. And if I'm remembering right, this one, he pointed to a particular rune, angular and vicious looking, was called the Master's Mark. The Master of the 7, their leader, like. Dr. Ashworth felt his stomach tighten. Their leader, the one who taught the others, who bound them together in their dark work. They say he was the most powerful and the most wicked. When they was caught, however, that came about, and the stories differ, he was the last to die, and the hardest to kill. They buried him deepest and marked his stone most heavy, and that is the stone I uncovered. If that's his rune you've drawn there, then yes. God help you, sir. God help us all. Pharaoh rose stiffly to his feet. I've said what I came to say. You asked for knowledge, and I've given it. What you do with it is your affair. But if you've any sense, you'll leave Thornwick in the morning and not look back. I intend to do precisely that. The old man shook his head. Then you've less sense than I credited you with. You don't understand yet, do you? It's not a matter of leaving. Once the Master's marked you, and marked you he has. Or else we wouldn't be having this talk. Distance won't save you. He'll follow. Or rather, you'll carry him with you, in your thoughts, in your dreams. The only way to be free of him is to seal him again, proper and permanent. How? That I don't know. The old woman never told me that part, if she knew it herself. But the rectors used to know, or some of them did. There might be something in the church records, or in the priory ruins themselves. You're a scholar, sir. If anyone can find the way, it'd be you. With that, Pharaoh nodded and returned to his companions, leaving Dr. Ashworth alone with his thoughts. The tap room seemed suddenly to warm, to close. He finished his ale without tasting it and climbed the stairs to his room. The corridor was darker than it should have been. The candle that usually burned on the table had gone out, or been extinguished. Dr. Ashworth fumbled for his key, his hands unsteady. As he fitted it into the lock, he heard, quite distinctly, a soft sound from within the room. A footstep. He froze, listening. Nothing more came. Perhaps it had been the settling of floorboards, or a sound from another room misheard. He turned the key and pushed open the door. The room was as he had left it, or appeared to be. The lamp was unlit on the table. His papers were stacked neatly beside it. The bed was undisturbed, yet the quality of the darkness was wrong, somehow thicker, more present, as though it were not merely the absence of light, but a substance in itself. Dr. Ashworth struck a match and lit the lamp. The flame caught, flickered, then steadied. In its growing glow, he made a circuit of the room, checking the window closed and latched, the wardrobe empty save for his own clothing, the space beneath the bed nothing but floorboards and dust. He was being absurd. The conversation with Pharaoh had unsettled him, that was all. He prepared for bed with deliberate calm, arranging his notes for the morning, laying out his clothes. He would leave on the first available train. Whatever Pharaoh said about distance being no protection, surely in Cambridge, surrounded by the rational world of the university, this nightmare would fade. Yet as he extinguished the lamp and climbed into bed, he could not shake the sensation that he was not alone. The darkness pressed close, and in it he seemed to sense a presence not hostile precisely, but intensely aware, intensely focused, watching, waiting. He lay rigid, his eyes open though he could see nothing. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. He had lost all sense of time. And then, so soft he almost missed it, he heard it again, breathing, not his own. This was slower, deeper, with a faint rasp to it, as though the lungs that drew it were damaged or decayed. It came from the corner of the room, near the window. In, out, steady, patient. Dr. Ashworth could not move. Terror held him paralyzed. He wanted to cry out, to strike a light, to flee, but his body would not obey. He could only lie there, listening to that terrible respiration, knowing that something stood in the darkness mere feet away. Then it moved. He heard the soft scrape of cloth on wood as it shifted its position. A board creaked. The breathing continued, closer now. It was approaching the bed. A smell reached him, earth and mold and something worse, something organic and corrupt. The breathing was at the bedside now, almost directly above him. He felt the faintest stirring of air against his face, as though something were leaning down, examining him. He tried to speak, to pray, to scream anything, but his throat had closed. He could only lie there, rigid with horror, as the thing bent closer. He felt certain that at any moment it would touch him, and the thought of that contact, of what those hands might be like, was unbearable. And then, quite clearly, in a voice like wind through dead leaves, it spoke. Mine, it whispered. You are mine now. The lamp on the table burst into flame, a spontaneous ignition that was impossible, yet happened nonetheless. In its sudden glare, Dr. Ashworth caught the briefest glimpse of what stood beside his bed. It was tall, impossibly tall, gaunt, draped in what might once have been robes but were now mere tatters. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a skull thinly covered with parchment-like skin, and in the hollow sockets, burned to points of light that might have been eyes. One skeletal hand, extended toward him, bore on each finger a ring carved with runes. Then the lamp went out with a sound like a gasp, and the darkness crashed back. But the thing was gone. The breathing had ceased. The room was empty. Dr. Ashworth lay shaking in the blackness, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes had seen. It was not possible. It could not be. Yet the smell remained, that terrible odor of the grave, and on the pillow beside his head. He felt a dampness, as though something had dripped there. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, he rose like an old man. His hands trembled as he dressed. His reflection in the small mirror showed a face aged by terror, eyes ringed with shadow. On the pillow where he had felt the dampness, there was a stain, dark, irregular, that looked for all the world like grave mold. And on the floor beside the bed, pressed into the dust, was a single footprint, long, narrow, and quite clearly not made by any living foot. Dr. Ashworth did not go down to breakfast. He could not face the thought of food, or of casual conversation, or of pretending that the world was still the rational, ordered place he had believed it to be 24 hours ago. Instead, he remained in his room as the morning light strengthened, attempting to impose some structure on his shattered thoughts. The evidence was undeniable. Either he was suffering from some form of breakdown, hallucinations brought on by stress and suggestion, or he was genuinely being haunted by something that had been dead for more than 1,000 years. Neither possibility was comforting. He examined the footprint carefully in the daylight. It was real, not a trick of shadow or imagination. The dust had been pressed down in a clear pattern, the ball of a foot, elongated toes, a narrow heel. But the proportions were wrong, subtly distorted, as though the foot that made it had been stretched somehow, pulled thin. The stain on the pillow was equally real. He touched it gingerly and found it damp and cold, with that same smell of earth and corruption. When he brought his fingers to his nose, he gagged and had to rush to the wash basin, where he retched miserably, though his stomach was empty. A knock at the door made him start violently. Dr. Ashworth? It was Godbold's voice, gruff and concerned. Are you well, sir? I've not seen you this morning. I am indisposed, Dr. Ashworth managed. I will require another night's lodging, if the room is available. A pause. The room's yours as long as you need it, sir. But if you're ill, perhaps I should send for the doctor? No, that won't be necessary. I simply need rest. He heard Godbold's footsteps retreating down the corridor and exhaled slowly. He had intended to leave today, but Pharaoh's words haunted him. Distance won't save you. If the old man was right, and the events of last night suggested he was then fleeing Thornwick, would accomplish nothing. The thing that had claimed him would follow, or rather, was already with him in some fashion, bound to him by the disturbance of the marked stone. You are mine now. The words echoed in his memory, spoken in that terrible voice. What did it mean? Possession? Consumption? Some form of spiritual parasitism that would slowly drain him until he was a hollow shell? Dr. Ashworth forced himself to think methodically. If Pharaoh was correct about the solution lying in the church records or the priory itself, then that was where he must look. He had come to Thornwick as a scholar. He would face this problem as a scholar. There had to be some means of resealing the grave, some ritual or formula that could bind the thing back into darkness. He gathered his materials, notebooks, pencils, his reference books, and descended the stairs. Godbold watched him from behind the bar with an expression that mixed concern and something that looked like fear. The landlord knew, or suspected. Perhaps the whole village knew. Perhaps they had been waiting to see how long it would take for the stranger, who had disturbed the seven, to realize what he had done. The church was empty when Dr. Ashworth arrived. Reverend Blackwell, according to his housekeeper, had gone to visit a parishioner in the next village and would not return until evening. This suited Dr. Ashworth's purpose. He let himself into the vestry and began his search of the historical records. There were account books dating back to the 17th century, baptismal registers, marriage records, records of burials, the ordinary documentation of rural parish life. But tucked away in a lower drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, he found something more promising, a leather-bound volume labeled simply Antiquitates. The book proved to be a commonplace collection maintained by successive rectors, containing notes on local history, folklore, and matters of ecclesiastical interest. Most of it was of little relevance: notes on church architecture, transcriptions of inscriptions, genealogies of local families. But near the end, in a section dating from the 1830s, he found what he was looking for. The handwriting was cramped and difficult, but Dr. Ashworth persevered. The rector of that period, a Reverend Josiah Carn, had written extensively about the incident Pharaoh had mentioned, when the farm laborer had gone mad after hearing voices from beneath the ground. March 14, 1831, James Weatherby, aged 32, employed in plowing the field called Hangman's Field, has been taken with a violent mania. He claims to hear voices calling to him from beneath the soil, voices that promise him power and knowledge if only he will dig down to their source. He has attempted to do so with his bare hands, tearing at the earth until his fingers bled, and had to be physically restrained. Dr. Morrison believes it to be a fever of the brain and recommends confinement. March 20th, 1831. Weatherby's condition has not improved. He raves constantly in a language that Dr. Morrison does not recognize, and which none of the village people can identify. I have sent a description to my colleague Rev. Armitage in Cambridge, who has some knowledge of ancient tongues. March 28th, 1831. Armitage writes that the syllables I transcribed appear to be a debased form of Old Norse, possibly with elements of pre-Christian Germanic incantation. He strongly advises that I investigate the history of the field where Weatherby was working. April 3, 1831. I have examined such records as exist regarding Hangman's Field and the 7 graves therein. The most complete account is found in the foundation charter of St. Guthlac's Priory 1147, which states plainly that the field was the site of executions and burials in the time before the church came to this land. 7 practitioners of heathen magic were put to death and buried with marked stones to prevent their spirits from walking. The priory was established to maintain a perpetual watch and to perform regular rites of binding. I now believe that Weatherby's condition is not mere madness, but the result of some malign influence from those buried in the field. The dissolution of the priory removed the protective rites, and over time, the seals have weakened. April 10, 1831. I have performed a rite of binding at the field, using a formula I discovered in an old grimoire belonging to my predecessor. The rite requires the drawing of a circle round each marked grave, the recitation of specific psalms, and the sprinkling of blessed salt and water while calling upon the name above all names to strengthen the seals. and renew the chains that bind the dead. April 12, 1831. Weatherby is much improved. The voices, he says, have ceased. He remembers nothing of his ravings and attributes his illness to a fever. I have not disabused him of this notion. It is better that some knowledge remain restricted to those equipped by office and education to bear it. Dr. Ashworth read the passage 3 times, memorizing the details. A rite of binding, a circle drawn around each grave, specific psalms, but which ones? Blessed salt and water, and an invocation. He searched through the rest of the volume, hoping to find more specific instructions or a transcription of the grimoire Carne had mentioned. But there was nothing. The subsequent entries dealt with more mundane matters. Either Carne had recorded the ritual elsewhere or had deliberately left it incomplete. Dr. Ashworth sat back, frustrated but not without hope. He had the outline of what was needed. The specifics might be reconstructed through research. Psalms of binding and protection. There were several candidates in Scripture. The grimoire itself, might it still exist among the church's possessions? He began a systematic search of the vestry, examining every shelf and drawer. Most contained nothing of interest, but in a locked cabinet he had to break the lock. An act he would have to explain later. He found a collection of older books. There were several 18th century volumes of sermons, a Greek New Testament, and at the bottom, wrapped in black cloth, a small octavo volume bound in cracked leather. The cover bore no title, but when he opened it, he saw on the flyleaf, Liber Vincularum, the Book of Bindings, for the use of those who must contend with unquiet spirits and the walking dead. His hands trembled as he turned the pages. The book was a manual of exorcism and spiritual warfare, compiled by some medieval cleric and added to by subsequent hands. There were prayers in Latin, diagrams of protective circles, lists of herbs and substances with apotropaic properties, and near the end, a section headed, For the Binding of the Unjustly Risen. Dr. Ashworth read it through once, then again more carefully. The ritual was complex, requiring preparation and materials he did not have. But it was possible, with Reverend Blackwell's help, assuming the rector could be persuaded it could be done. He was so absorbed in his reading that he did not notice the light in the vestry changing. The sun had passed behind clouds, and the room had grown dim. When he finally looked up, intending to light a candle, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. On the wall opposite, where the light from the window fell across the whitewashed plaster, a shadow had appeared. It was the shadow of a man, a tall, thin figure in robes, standing motionless. But when Dr. Ashworth looked toward the window, there was nothing there to cast such a shadow. The room was empty save for himself. As he watched, frozen, the shadow moved. It turned its head, as if looking directly at him, and raised one arm in a gesture that might have been beckoning or threatening. Then it began to grow, spreading across the wall, darkening, until it seemed less like a shadow than a rent in the fabric of the world. A window into some utterly lightless place. Dr. Ashworth stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. The shadow continued to spread, creeping across the ceiling now, blotting out the pale daylight, and from it came a sound, a low, sustained note like the tolling of a cracked bell, vibrating in his bones, filling his skull. He seized the Book of Bindings and fled the vestry, slamming the door behind him. In the church proper, the light was better, filtered through stained glass into patches of blue and red. He stood gasping, his heart hammering, while the door he had closed rattled gently in its frame. Then it stopped. Silence returned. Dr. Ashworth approached the door cautiously and peered through the keyhole. The vestry beyond appeared normal. The shadow was gone. Only ordinary afternoon light filled the room. But on the floor, clearly visible even through the small aperture, was a trail of something dark and wet leading from the wall to the door. It looked like water or oil or perhaps blood. Dr. Ashworth backed away. The church, which had seemed a sanctuary, now felt dangerous. The thing was growing stronger, more capable of manifesting in the world. Soon it would not need darkness or isolated rooms. Soon it would be able to appear anywhere, at any time. He clutched the Book of Bindings to his chest and hurried from the church. Behind him, he heard or thought he heard the sound of the vestry door opening. But he did not look back. He ran through the churchyard, past the weathered headstones, through the gate, and did not stop until he reached the street. Several villagers were abroad, and they stared at him as he passed at his wild eyes. His disheveled appearance, the book clutched under his arm. They knew, their expression said. They had seen this before, or heard of it. The mark of the 7 was upon him, and he was already half lost. Dr. Ashworth returned to the inn in a state approaching desperation. He must act quickly. Tonight, if possible, before the thing grew any stronger, before it manifested fully, before it claimed him completely. He found Godbold and demanded to know when Reverend Blackwell would return. The landlord, seeing his agitation, said he would send his boy to fetch the rector immediately. While he waited, Dr. Ashworth barricaded himself in his room and began to study the ritual in earnest. Outside, the afternoon waned toward evening. The shadows lengthened, and in the attic above, something that had learned patience in its centuries of darkness settled down to wait for nightfall. Reverend Blackwell arrived at the inn just after 6 o'clock, brought by Godbold's urgent summons. He found Dr. Ashworth in a state of agitation that verged on hysteria. Surrounded by books and papers, the book of bindings open on the table before him. Dr. Ashworth, the rector said, his voice carefully calm. Godbold tells me you've had some manner of upset. Perhaps you should read this. Dr. Ashworth interrupted, thrusting the open book toward him. The ritual for binding the unjustly risen. You must help me perform it. Tonight, there is no time to waste. Reverend Blackwell took the book and recognized it immediately. His expression became grave. Where did you find this? It should have been locked away. It was locked away. I broke the lock. That hardly matters now. Don't you understand? I've awakened one of the 7, their leader, the master, and he is growing stronger by the hour. He manifests in shadows, in dreams, in physical form. He has marked me as his own. Unless we reseal his grave according to this ritual, he will. Dr. Ashworth's voice broke. God knows what he will do. The rector sat down heavily. Tell me everything that has happened. Dr. Ashworth recounted it all, the mysterious vellum, the discovery of the marked stone, the sounds in the night, the footprint, the shadow in the vestry. He spoke rapidly, words tumbling over one another, aware that he sounded like a madman, but unable to stop. When he finished, Reverend Blackwell sat in silence for a long moment. I believe you, he said at last. God help us both, but I believe you. I have heard too many stories, read too many accounts in the parish records, to dismiss this as mere imagination. And I have seen the book of bindings used before. Dr. Ashworth looked up sharply. You have. Once, when I first came to Thornwick, 15 years ago, there was an incident, a minor one, thankfully. A boy who wandered into Hangman's Field and came back changed. Not possessed, precisely, but touched, influenced. My predecessor performed a rite of purification, using formulae from that book. It was effective. He paused. But what you describe is far more serious. You have not merely been touched by the influence of the 7. You have been claimed by their leader. Then help me break that claim. The ritual is dangerous, Reverend Blackwell said firmly. For both of us. To perform it properly, we must go to the grave itself, at night, and confront directly whatever resides there. The ritual creates a spiritual battlefield, and if our faith wavers, if our will falters even for a moment, the thing we are trying to bind could instead bind us. What choice do we have? The rector studied him with eyes that had seen more than their kindly appearance suggested. None, I fear. Very well. We must prepare carefully. I will need to gather the necessary materials, salt blessed with specific prayers, holy water consecrated for this purpose, candles of beeswax incense. You must fast from now until the ritual and spend the intervening hours in prayer and meditation. The mind must be clear, the will focused. Any doubt or fear is a doorway through which the entity can enter. I am afraid, Dr. Ashworth admitted. Terribly afraid. Fear is natural. What matters is that you do not let it master you. Reverend Blackwell rose. I will return at midnight. Be ready. And Dr. Ashworth, until then, do not leave this room. Lock the door. Light as many candles as you can. The thing grows stronger in darkness and solitude. After the rector departed, Dr. Ashworth did as instructed. He locked the door, wedged a chair beneath the handle for good measure, and lit every candle in the room. The flames pushed back the shadows into the corners, but could not entirely dispel them. He attempted to pray, as Blackwell had advised, but found his mind wandering, unable to focus. The afternoon faded to evening. Through the window, he watched darkness claim the village. Lamps were lit in the houses across the green. In the tap room below, he heard the murmur of voices, the clink of glasses, sounds of normalcy that seemed to come from another world entirely. He tried to read the ritual again, to memorize its steps, but the Latin words slid past his comprehension. His mind felt sluggish, resistant. Twice he caught himself nodding, his eyes closing despite his determination to stay alert. This too, he realized, was part of the haunting. The thing was sapping his will, drawing strength from him as it had drawn strength from the disturbance of its grave. As the church clock struck 9, he heard the sound again, the dragging footsteps above, slow and deliberate, back and forth across the attic, as though something were pacing. Godbold had said the attic contained only old furniture, but Dr. Ashworth knew better now. It contained something far less innocent. The pacing stopped. A long silence followed, during which Dr. Ashworth became aware of his own breathing, loud in the quiet room. Then 3 knocks on the ceiling, slow, deliberate, knock, knock, knock. His hands clenched on the arms of his chair. He would not respond, would not acknowledge it. The ritual at midnight would end this nightmare, but the knocking came again, louder now, more insistent, and with it, a voice, the same terrible voice he had heard the previous night. Like wind through dead leaves, "Scholar," it whispered, seeming to come not from above but from all around him. "Scholar who disturbed my rest, did you think you could bind me with words and water? I have lain in darkness for 1,000 years. I have grown strong on the accumulated power of centuries. Your little ritual will not hold me. Nothing can hold me now. You lie," Dr. Ashworth forced himself to say. "You are bound by the marked stone, by the seals placed upon your grave." Laughter, if that sound could be called laughter. It was like the rustling of dry bones. The seals have weakened. The stone was disturbed. And you read the runes, spoke them with your eyes, carried them away in your mind. That was invitation enough. That was all I needed. I did not speak them aloud. No, but you will. When I am fully risen, when I stand before you in my restored power, you will speak them. You will speak the words that open the way for my brothers. You will call forth all 7. And then the voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried perfect clarity. Then we will reclaim this land as we once held it. In the ancient days before the Christ came to bind us, we will be worshipped again. We will be feared. And you, scholar, will be the instrument of our return. Never, Dr. Ashworth said. But his voice shook. The candles flickered, though there was no draft. The shadows in the corners deepened, grew solid. And from them, materializing like smoke becoming flesh, a figure began to emerge. It was the same being he had glimpsed the previous night, but clearer now, more present. Taller than any man, impossibly thin, wrapped in rotting robes that hung in tatters. The skull face was more defined, the skin stretched so tight over bone that it seemed ready to tear. But it was the eyes that drew and held his gaze, those points of light in the hollow sockets, burning with an intelligence that was inhuman and utterly malevolent. The thing took a step into the room, then another. It moved with a strange, gliding motion, as though its feet did not quite touch the floor. As it approached, the temperature plummeted. Dr. Ashworth could see his breath misting in the candlelight. He tried to rise, to flee, but found himself paralyzed. The thing's gaze held him pinned like an insect. It leaned down, bringing its face close to his, and he smelled again that terrible odor of the grave, mixed now with something spicy and acrid. "Like burnt incense, you are mine," it repeated, and one skeletal hand, rings glinting dully on every finger, reached out and touched his forehead. The contact was ice and fire simultaneously. Dr. Ashworth felt something enter him, a cold presence that slithered into his mind like a serpent. His vision went dark. When it cleared, he was no longer seeing through his own eyes. He was underground, buried, lying in absolute darkness, pressed down by earth and stone. He could not move, could not speak, could only lie there in the suffocating blackness, aware of the weight of centuries passing, of rage and hatred building like pressure behind a dam, waiting for release. And around him, in other graves nearby, he sensed the others. 6 more of the 7, also bound, also waiting. Their minds touched his, sharing their fury, their hunger, their desperate need for vengeance against those who had killed them, and those who kept them imprisoned. You see, the Master's voice said in his mind, "You understand now. We are not evil, scholar. We are wronged. We possessed knowledge that the new religion feared, and so they destroyed us. But knowledge cannot be destroyed. It merely waits. And now, through you, it will be free again." The vision released him. He was back in his room, gasping, tears streaming down his face. The thing still stood before him, but seemed to have grown more solid, more real. It was feeding on him, he realized, drawing strength from his fear, from his life force itself. With tremendous effort, Dr. Ashworth reached for the book of bindings on the table. His fingers touched the leather cover. Immediately, the thing recoiled, its form wavering like smoke. "That will not save you," it hissed. "Not until your priest performs his ritual. And much can happen before midnight. Much can happen indeed." It dissolved into shadows and was gone, but its presence remained, permeating the room like a stain. Dr. Ashworth clutched the book to his chest and began to pray out the formal prayers of the church, but desperate, incoherent pleas for protection, for strength, for dawn. The candles burned lower. The shadows crept closer, and in the attic above, the pacing resumed, back and forth, relentless as the ticking of a clock counting down to midnight. The words struck at something deep in Dr. Ashworth's character. He was a scholar. His life's work was the recovery and preservation of lost knowledge, and here before him stood something that possessed knowledge from an era before written records, knowledge that would be lost forever if the binding succeeded. "Do not listen to him," Blackwell said sharply. "He is a liar. Whatever knowledge he possessed was corrupt, poisoned. Its preservation would benefit no one. Let the scholar decide that for himself," the Master said. "I offer you a choice, Dr. Edmund Ashworth. Help me. Speak the words that will break the remaining seals on my brothers' graves. Together we can restore the old ways, not to replace your precious civilization, but to coexist with it, to enrich it. Imagine a world where the ancient wisdom and modern learning are joined. Imagine what could be achieved." For a moment, the briefest moment, Dr. Ashworth was tempted. In his mind's eye he saw it, himself as the bridge between 2 ages, the scholar who recovered knowledge that had been lost for a millennium. His name would be remembered forever. He would have achieved something no other academic ever had. Then he saw the rest of the vision, the price of that knowledge. The Master was not offering partnership but slavery. The old ways he spoke of were ways of blood and darkness, of power purchased at the cost of human suffering. Whatever wisdom the 7 had possessed, it had been the wisdom of predators, not teachers, no. Dr. Ashworth said, and this time his voice was steady, "I reject you and all you represent. Whatever connection was formed when I disturbed your grave, I sever it now. You have no claim on me. You have no power over me. In the name of truth and light and all that is good in human learning, I cast you out." The Master's form wavered, became less solid. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Blackwell seized the moment, raising the book high and reading in a voice that rang with authority. "By the power vested in me by God and His Church, by the authority of Saint Guthlac who first sanctified this ground, by the names of all the angels and the saints, I bind you. Return to your grave. Return and be sealed. Return and remain until the ending of days." He cast holy water directly at the Master's form. Where the drop struck, the figure smoked and shrank. Blackwell followed with incense, wafting it toward the entity, and it recoiled as though struck by physical blows. Dr. Ashworth, emboldened, seized the salt and flung a handful at the Master. The grains struck the figure like burning sparks, and it howled a sound of rage and agony that made the earth tremble. "Return," Blackwell commanded. "I seal you with salt and water. I seal you with prayer and iron. I seal you with the cross of Christ and the names of power. Return and be bound." The Master staggered backward, his form dissolving. The burning eyes went dim. The skeletal hands clawed at empty air. And then, with a cry that seemed to come from the earth itself, the entity collapsed inward and fell into the grave from which it had emerged. Immediately, Pharaoh sprang forward with his spade. Working with frantic speed, he began to fill in the grave, shoveling earth over the marked stone, over the place where the master had fallen. Blackwell joined him, using his hands when the spade couldn't reach, all the while continuing to pray. Dr. Ashworth stood watching, suddenly exhausted. He felt as though he had run a great distance or fought a physical battle. His legs trembled, his hands shook, but he felt something else, to a lightness, as though a burden had been lifted. The cold presence that had inhabited his mind was gone. The connection had been severed. "Help us," Blackwell gasped. "The earth must be packed down. The stone must be covered completely, quickly, before it gathers strength to rise again." Dr. Ashworth knelt and began to shovel earth with his bare hands. The three of them worked together, filling the grave, pressing down the soil, until at last the marked stone was completely hidden beneath the mound of earth. Pharaoh placed several large rocks atop the mound, and Blackwell blessed them, tracing the sign of the cross upon each one. Finally, when it was done, they stood back, breathing heavily. The wind had died. The night was still. The candles continued to burn with their steady light. "Is it finished?" Dr. Ashworth asked. "For now," Blackwell replied. He was pale and drawn, but his expression was one of grim satisfaction. "The binding should hold, but the grave must be watched and prayers said regularly to maintain the seal. That is why the priory was established, and why, after its dissolution, the rectors of Thornwick have maintained the tradition." He looked at Dr. Ashworth seriously. "You understand now why some things are best left undisturbed." "I do," Dr. Ashworth said quietly. "Believe me, I do." They gathered their materials and began the walk back to the village. Dawn was perhaps 2 hours away, and already the sky to the east showed the first hint of gray. As they crossed Hangman's Field for what Dr. Ashworth devoutly hoped would be the last time, he glanced back once toward the site of the master's grave. For just a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing there in the darkness, tall, thin, watching them retreat. But when he blinked and looked again, there was nothing, only the empty field and the wind stirring the grass. "Come," Blackwell said, touching his arm. "Don't look back. That's an old rule, and a good one." They walked on through the darkness toward the sleeping village, and behind them, deep beneath the earth, sealed by rock and salt and prayer, the Master of the Seven settled back into his prison and began, once more, the long wait for another chance at freedom. Dr. Ashworth should have felt relief. The ritual had been performed, the entity bound, the connection severed. Yet as he lay in his bed at the inn, watching the gray light of dawn creep across the ceiling, he could not shake a profound sense of unease. Something was wrong. The binding had worked, he was certain of that. He no longer felt the cold presence in his mind, no longer sensed that he was being watched. But there was something else, something he could not quite articulate. A wrongness in the air, a tension, like the feeling before a thunderstorm. He rose and dressed. Though he had not slept, every muscle ached as though he had indeed been in a physical fight. In the mirror, his face looked haggard, aged. The events of the past days had taken their toll. Downstairs, he found Godbold already at work, though it was barely past 5 o'clock. The landlord gave him a sharp look. "You were out last night," he said. It was not quite an accusation, but neither was a casual observation. "I was. With Reverend Blackwell. We attended to a matter in the field." Godbold's expression suggested he knew exactly what matter had been attended to. "Is it finished, then?" "Yes, it is sealed." The landlord nodded slowly. "I hope you're right, sir. But if you'll take advice from a man who's lived in these parts all his life, don't be too certain. The Seven are cunning, more cunning than any of us can know." Dr. Ashworth felt a chill. "What do you mean?" But Godbold had turned away, busying himself with the preparation of breakfast, and would say nothing more. Dr. Ashworth forced himself to eat, though food had no taste. He was gathering his things, preparing to pack and finally leave this cursed village, when there came a frantic knocking at the door. Godbold answered it to reveal one of the village boys, red-faced and gasping. "It's the rector, sir." The boy cried, "Reverend Blackwell, you must come quick." Dr. Ashworth seized his coat and followed the boy at a run through the village to the rectory. The door stood open. Inside, he found a small crowd gathered: the rector's housekeeper, an elderly doctor, and Tom Farrow, who looked pale and shaken. Reverend Blackwell lay on a couch in his study, unconscious. His face was gray, his breathing shallow. The doctor was examining him with evident concern. "What happened?" Dr. Ashworth demanded. "I found him an hour ago," the housekeeper said, her voice trembling, "on the floor of his study. He must have collapsed sometime after returning from wherever he was last night. Dr. Morrison says it's like no illness he's seen." The doctor straightened, wiping his hands. "His pulse is weak and irregular. His temperature is well below normal, almost as though he were suffering from exposure. Yet the house is warm. And look at this." He lifted Blackwell's hand to show Dr. Ashworth. On the rector's palm was a mark, a burn, or something like a burn. It was in the shape of a rune, one of the characters from the marked stone. Dr. Ashworth's blood turned to ice. "When did this appear?" "It was there when I found him," the housekeeper said. "And there's more." She led him to the desk, where the book of bindings lay open. Several pages had been torn out roughly, violently, leaving ragged edges. "The pages containing the ritual we performed," Dr. Ashworth said slowly. "They're gone." Farrow stepped forward. "There's something else, sir. Something I didn't want to say in front of the others. But you need to know. When I got home last night early this morning, I felt strange, watched. And when I looked out my window toward the field, I saw something." "What did you see?" "Lights, sir. 7 of them, spread across the field. Faint like marsh gas, but moving with purpose. They gathered together, near the center, and burned brighter. Then they went out. But I had the feeling," he hesitated, "the feeling that something had been agreed upon. Some plan had been made." Dr. Ashworth's mind raced. 7 lights. The 7 who were buried in the field. But they had only disturbed one grave, only confronted one entity. "Unless," the master said, "he would call forth his brothers," he said aloud. "When he had fully risen, he said I would speak the words that would free them all." We stopped him before that could happen. But what if the binding itself, the confrontation, gave him the opening he needed? What if, in rising from his grave, he weakened the seals on the others? Then all 7 could be loose. Farrow's voice was barely a whisper, or loose enough to act in concert. Even if not fully manifested, Dr. Ashworth turned to the doctor. "Will he live?" "I cannot say. It is as though his life force is being drained away. If this continues, he will be dead by nightfall. Then we have until nightfall to stop it." Dr. Ashworth seized the book of bindings. "The ritual we performed was for binding a single entity. If the 7 are acting together, we need something more comprehensive." He began searching through the book, scanning pages rapidly. "They're near the back, a ritual labeled for the binding of multiple unquiet spirits." But it was complex, far more involved than what they had performed the previous night, and it required at least 2 practitioners working in concert. Blackwell was unconscious, possibly dying. That left only Dr. Ashworth, and he was no priest, no trained exorcist. He was a scholar with no practical experience in spiritual warfare. Yet who else was there? The village had no other clergymen. The nearest town was 7 miles away, and by the time help could be fetched, it might well be too late. "Mr. Farrow," he said, making a decision. "Can you read?" "Aye, sir. Not Latin, but English well enough. That will have to suffice. We must return to the field. Tonight, at dusk, when the barriers between worlds are thinnest, we will perform this ritual and bind all 7 of them at once, permanently, sir. With respect, you're not a priest. Can you even perform such a ritual?" "I don't know," Dr. Ashworth admitted. "But I must try. This is my fault. I disturbed the grave. I set these events in motion. I must be the one to end them." He spent the remainder of the day in frantic preparation. He visited the church and gathered what materials he could: salt, holy water, candles, incense. He studied the ritual until he had committed much of it to memory. And he prayed, not the formal prayers of the liturgy, but desperate, heartfelt pleas for strength and guidance. As afternoon waned toward evening, he was visited by an unexpected caller. It was the doctor, looking grave. "I thought you should know," he said. "Reverend Blackwell has not improved. Indeed, he has worsened, but he regained consciousness briefly about an hour ago. He asked for you. I told him you were preparing to return to the field, to complete the binding. He wished me to give you a message. What message? He said, tell him to remember that faith is not about certainty. It is about trust in the face of uncertainty. The words of the ritual have power, but only if the speaker believes they have power. His belief will be his shield, or his undoing. Dr. Ashworth nodded slowly. Thank you for bringing me that message. As dusk approached, he and Pharaoh made their way once more across Hangman's Field. The old man carried the lantern and the spade. Dr. Ashworth carried the materials for the ritual and the book of bindings. The sky above was heavy with clouds, and the wind had risen, carrying on it a smell of rain, and something that reminded Dr. Ashworth unpleasantly of the odor that had accompanied the master's manifestation. They reached the center of the field, where the 7 graves were distributed in a rough circle. The mound they had raised over the master's grave was still intact, but as Dr. Ashworth looked at the other 6 sites, he saw something that made his heart sink. The earth above each grave was disturbed, not open, not yet, but cracked, pushed up from beneath as though something were pressing against it from below. And from these cracks came a faint, sickly light, the same light Pharaoh had seen the previous night. They're coming up, Pharaoh said, his voice tight with fear. All of them. Then we must work quickly. Dr. Ashworth began to lay out his materials, his hands surprisingly steady despite the terror that gripped him. He traced a large circle in salt, encompassing all 7 graves. At 7 points around the circle's edge, he placed candles and lit them. Then he positioned himself at what he judged to be the northernmost point, Pharaoh standing just outside the circle to the east. He opened the book of bindings and began to read. The ritual was long and complex, requiring exact pronunciation of words in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Dr. Ashworth stumbled more than once, but pressed on, aware that darkness was falling rapidly and that the light from the graves was growing brighter. As he spoke, the earth began to tremble. The cracks above the graves widened, and from them, slowly, shapes began to emerge. They were similar to the master but less distinct, less fully formed, wraith-like figures that pulled themselves up from the ground with terrible effort, as though fighting against invisible restraints. They were the other 6 of the 7, responding to their leader's call, rising despite the seals that had held them for so long that Dr. Ashworth raised his voice, reading faster. He cast holy water toward the emerging figures, and they recoiled, but did not retreat. The ritual called for him to name each spirit and command it individually to return to its grave. But he did not know their names. That information, if it had ever been recorded, was lost to time. He improvised, commanding them collectively, you who were put down in the ancient days, you who practiced forbidden arts, I command you in the name of all that is holy to return to your graves and remain there bound. The figures paused in their emergence. They turned their attention to him, 6 pairs of burning eyes fixed on him with hatred and hunger. And then, from the 7th grave, from the mound they had so carefully sealed, came a voice he recognized. Did you truly believe you had bound me? The master said, and his tone was one of amused contempt. Your little ritual was nothing, a momentary inconvenience. You gave me exactly what I needed, a direct confrontation, a channel through which to extend my power. And now, through the priest, I drain the life force necessary to complete my restoration. By dawn, I will be fully corporeal, and my brothers will join me. The mound exploded outward in a shower of earth and stone. The master rose again, but this time he was different, more solid, more present. The translucent quality was gone. He stood before Dr. Ashworth not as a ghost or wraith, but as something that could act directly upon the physical world. No, Dr. Ashworth whispered, double quotes, yes. You thought you were the hero of this tale, scholar, but you were merely the means to an end. I needed someone to disturb the seal, to read the runes, to carry my essence out of the field and spread it through the village. And when your priest came to bind me, I needed his power, his faith, as a conduit. He opened himself fully in that ritual, held nothing back, and in that moment of complete vulnerability, I entered him. Now I drain him dry and use his stolen strength to free my brothers. The 6 wraith-like figures grew more solid. They stepped fully out of their graves and began to move toward the circle. Dr. Ashworth continued reading the ritual, but his voice faltered. If the master spoke truth, if the first binding had been the trap rather than the solution, then this ritual would be equally useless. Belief, Blackwell had said. The words have power only if the speaker believes they have power. But how could he believe when confronted with evidence that everything he had attempted had only made things worse? The 6 figures reached the circle's edge. They tested it as the master had done the previous night, and their touch made the salt barrier glow and smoke. But they were weaker than their leader, still partially bound by the original seals. The circle held. Dr. Ashworth remained in Thornwick for another 3 days, resting and recovering his strength. The villagers, who had watched him with suspicion and fear, now treated him with a wary respect. They knew, in the way that villagers always know such things, that something significant had occurred in Hangman's Field. They did not ask for details, and Dr. Ashworth did not volunteer them. On his last morning, he walked once more to the field, not to the graves themselves but to the edge, where he could look across the expanse of rough grass. In the morning light, it appeared ordinary enough, just another piece of fallow land, perhaps unlucky in its associations, but no more threatening than any other field. Yet he knew what lay beneath. 7 graves, 7 marked stones, 7 entities bound by knowledge and naming and the eternal vigilance of those who understood the necessity of keeping certain things contained. Tom Farrow found him there, standing at the field's edge. "You'll be leaving today, then, sir?" the old man asked. "Yes, the afternoon train. It's past time I returned to Cambridge. And will you write about what happened here in your scholarly works?" Dr. Ashworth considered the question carefully. "No," he said at last. "Some knowledge is better left unrecorded, or rather recorded only in such a way that it cannot be misused. I will note in my papers that St. Guthlac's Priory was built on a site of pre-Christian significance, and that certain practices occurred there in ancient times, but the specifics, the runes, the rituals, the true nature of what was buried in this field, those will remain unwritten." Farrow nodded approvingly. "That's wise, sir. There's always some fool who'd try to dig them up, thinking he was being clever." "Exactly my thought." Dr. Ashworth turned away from the field. "Mr. Farrow, I would ask you to continue watching this place, not obsessively, but with awareness. If you see or hear anything unusual, any sign that the seals are weakening, contact Reverend Blackwell immediately, or contact me in Cambridge. I will, sir, though I hope there'll be no need, as do I." Dr. Ashworth extended his hand, and Farrow shook it, a gesture that, a week earlier, the old man would never have offered to a Cambridge scholar. "You have been of invaluable assistance, Mr. Farrow. The knowledge you possess, the old knowledge, passed down through your family, it is more precious than you perhaps realize. Guard it well, and teach it to someone you trust before you are gone." Farrow's expression grew grave. "My grandson, sir. Young Tom. He's 12 now, and sharp as a tack. I've been thinking it's time to begin teaching him, as my grandfather taught me. Though I confess I hoped he might never need to use what I'll tell him. Better to have the knowledge and not need it than to need it and not have it," Dr. Ashworth said. "The world is older and stranger than most people understand, Mr. Farrow. Men like you and now, perhaps, your grandson serve as a quiet bulwark against things that most would not believe existed. It is thankless work, but essential." They walked back to the village together, speaking of ordinary things, the weather, the upcoming harvest, the repair of the church roof, as if the events of the past week had been nothing more than a minor academic excursion. But both men knew better, and there was an understanding between them now that went deeper than words. Dr. Ashworth said his farewells to Reverend Blackwell in the vicarage study, where the medieval manuscript lay once again in its locked box. "What will you do with it?" Ashworth asked, gesturing to the box. "Return it to its hiding place in the church vault." Blackwell replied, "Where it has rested, undisturbed, for centuries. I will add a note, however, for any future vicar who might find it a warning, couched in careful language, that this is not a text for casual study. Good. And the transcription I made? I would recommend you destroy it, Dr. Ashworth, or at the very least, keep it under lock and key, with explicit instructions that it is not to be published or copied." Ashworth nodded slowly. "I had reached the same conclusion. I will keep it, I think, purely as a precaution. in case the knowledge proves necessary at some future date, but I will deposit it with my solicitor, with instructions that it is to be burned unopened in the event of my death, unless specific circumstances arise that require its preservation. You are being very thorough. I have learned to be thorough, Reverend. This past week has been instructive. Blackwell studied him with concern. You look tired still, Doctor. The experience in the field, it took something from you, I think. Perhaps. Or perhaps it gave me something, a perspective I had not possessed before. I came to Thornwick believing that scholarship was a matter of uncovering hidden truths and bringing them to light. Now I understand that some truths are hidden for good reason, and that true scholarship sometimes means knowing when to leave things buried. A hard lesson, but a necessary one. They shook hands, and Dr. Ashworth took his leave. As he walked down the vicarage drive, he glanced back once at St. Guthlac's church, its square tower solid against the autumn sky. It looked peaceful, timeless, a symbol of continuity and faith. Only he and a handful of others knew what lay in the field beyond, what ancient wickedness had been done there, and what eternal vigilance was required to keep it contained. The train journey back to Cambridge was uneventful. Dr. Ashworth dozed in his compartment, lulled by the rhythm of the rails, and dreamed troubled dreams of 7 stones and 7 names and a woman's face in the shadows. Beneath the earth, he woke with a start as the train pulled into Cambridge station, his heart racing. But the daylight and the familiar surroundings quickly dispelled the lingering unease. He collected his bags and made his way to his rooms in college, where his books and papers awaited him, and the comfortable routine of academic life. Yet he found he could not settle immediately back into his work. The manuscript on Anglo-Saxon burial practices that he had been writing before Thornwick seemed trivial now, almost frivolous. How could he write about burial customs without acknowledging the darker purposes that sometimes lay behind them? How could he discuss grave goods and funerary rites without mentioning the things that were sometimes buried not out of respect, but out of necessity, not to honor the dead, but to contain them? He could not, and so he set the manuscript aside and began instead to write something else, not for publication, but for his own understanding. He wrote an account of what had happened at Thornwick, setting down every detail he could remember: the 7 graves, the binding runes, the names of the condemned, the sensation of presence in Hangman's Field. He wrote of Tom Farrow's folk knowledge and Reverend Blackwell's ecclesiastical learning, and of how both had proved essential in understanding the true nature of what lay buried there. When he was finished, he read through the account twice, making small corrections and additions. Then he placed it in a manila envelope, sealed it with wax, and addressed it to his solicitor in London with explicit instructions. This document is to be kept sealed and secure. In the event of my death, it is to be burned unopened unless one of the following individuals requests it: the Reverend Blackwell of Thornwick, Mr. Thomas Farrow of Thornwick, or any future scholar who presents evidence of a specific need to know its contents, in connection with unusual occurrences in or around the village of Thornwick. In that last case, the solicitor's discretion is to be exercised with the greatest caution. He posted the envelope the next morning and felt a weight lift from him as he watched it disappear into the post bag. The knowledge was preserved, but safely contained, much like the things in Hangman's Field themselves. Dr. Ashworth did eventually return to his academic work, though his colleagues noticed a change in him. He was more cautious in his pronouncements, more willing to acknowledge the limits of scholarly knowledge. He published several well-regarded papers on Anglo-Saxon England, but they were marked by an unusual reticence, a tendency to note that certain practices remained obscure, certain texts ambiguous, certain sites best left unexcavated. Some found this frustrating. Dr. Pemberton of Oxford, in particular, accused him in print of having lost his scholarly nerve and of succumbing to an excess of caution that borders on superstition. Dr. Ashworth did not reply to these criticisms. Those who understood a small circle of scholars, who had themselves encountered the darker corners of England's past, recognized his reticence for what it was: not weakness, but wisdom. He never returned to Thornwick. He corresponded occasionally with Reverend Blackwell, and once received a brief letter from Tom Farrow informing him that all remained quiet at Hangman's Field, but he did not visit. The memory of those 3 days was too vivid, too unsettling. In his dreams, he sometimes still saw the 7 stones and felt the terrible weight of the names he had spoken. And he would wake in darkness with his heart pounding, and the certainty that something had been listening. The notes he had taken on the binding runes were kept in a locked drawer of his desk. He consulted them rarely, and only when some urgent scholarly question demanded it. But sometimes when working late at night, his hand would drift to the drawer and rest there, as if drawn by some unconscious impulse. And once, a colleague who visited him unexpectedly found him staring at a blank sheet of paper on which, faintly traced in pencil and then hastily erased, could be discerned the angular shape of a rune, not quite any rune in the standard Futhorc, but something older and more twisted. Dr. Ashworth offered no explanation, and his colleague did not press for one. And so the years passed. Dr. Ashworth grew older. His hair whitened, his back bent from long hours over manuscripts. He achieved a modest reputation in his field, respected if not celebrated, known for his careful scholarship and his curious reluctance to pursue certain lines of inquiry. He died in the winter of his 68th year, peacefully, in his sleep. His effects were disposed of according to his will. Most of his library went to the college. His papers were deposited in the university archives. The sealed envelope held by his solicitor was, in accordance with his instructions, burned unopened. No unusual occurrences had been reported in or around Thornwick, and no scholar had come forward with evidence of a need to know its contents. The knowledge of the 7 graves passed once more into obscurity, kept alive only by the pharaohs and the vicars of St. Guthlax, who walked sometimes to Hangman's Field and looked across it with understanding eyes, and who taught their successors the old stories and the old vigilance. As for Thornwick itself, it endures much as it always has, a small village on the edge of the fens, unremarkable to the casual visitor, marked on maps but seldom visited. The church of St. Guthlax stands as it has for centuries, its stones weathered but firm. The vicarage is occupied now by a young man fresh from seminary, full of enthusiasm and modern ideas about pastoral care and community engagement. He knows nothing of what lies in the medieval manuscript in the church vault, and it is perhaps better that way. Tom Farrow died in his 83rd year, and his grandson, also named Tom, as is the Farrow tradition, tends the family farm and keeps the old watch on Hangman's Field. He does not speak of why he does this, even to his own children, but on certain nights, when the wind is high and the moon is dark, he walks the perimeter of the field with a lantern in his hand, and he listens. The 7 stones remain undisturbed beneath the earth, and the 7 names remain unspoken, save in the dreams of those few who have heard them. The seals hold. The binding endures. And in Hangman's Field, nothing stirs. Yet. For the thing about such places, about such burials, such bindings, such carefully constructed prisons of rune and ritual, is that they are never permanent. They require maintenance, attention, belief. They rely on an unbroken chain of knowledge passed from generation to generation, from scholar to scholar, from priest to priest. And chains, however strong, can be broken. Perhaps it will be a generation from now, perhaps a century, perhaps longer still, but there will come a time when no one remembers why Hangman's Field is avoided, when the old stories are dismissed as superstition, when some well-meaning fool decides to develop the land or excavate the site, or simply remove those inconvenient stones that mar the surface of what could be productive farmland. When that day comes, and it will come, for that is the nature of time, and forgetting, the seals will break, the names will be forgotten, and what lies beneath will remember that it was once free, once worshipped, once fed, but that is a concern for another generation, another scholar, another keeper of uncomfortable truths. For now, in this present moment, the binding holds. The watch continues, and those who know the danger keep their vigil, as their predecessors did before them, and as their successors will do after them. For as long as knowledge and memory and vigilance endure. Dr. Ashworth understood this in the end. He understood that some battles are never truly won, only postponed, deferred to the next generation and the next. He understood that scholarship could be a form of guardianship, that knowledge could be both weapon and warning, and that sometimes the greatest wisdom lay in knowing what not to pursue. He took that understanding with him to his grave. And in Hangman's Field, Beneath 7 stones marked with 7 names, the ancient dead lie bound and dreaming, patient as only the dead can be patient, waiting as only the dead can wait. They have time. They have all the time in the world.